Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Sagar Utekar and this is day 10 of our free CK series. Today we are going to discuss very important topic for our CK exam, which is nothing but our Kubernetes namespaces. Namespaces are logical isolation of your Kubernetes resources on a single cluster. When we are working in a multiple teams environment and everyone wants to deploy the same application, then that's where your Kubernetes namespaces comes into picture. You can deploy similar application, creating different namespaces for different teams, and you can have the same application names for your resources. That's the advantage of using Kubernetes namespaces. Okay, and if you modify the resource in one namespace, it will not affect on other resources in the different namespaces. That is one more advantage of using namespaces. So for example, let's consider one use case. We are working in a team and we have dev team, QA team, production team. We have multiple dev environments. Let's say dev team also wants to deploy application of the Amazon, and QA team also wants to test the Amazon application, and they have created pods, deployments, and then maybe replica sets and config maps, secrets, and everything. So um, if both the teams wants to deploy the Amazon application with all the Kubernetes resources, if they try to deploy the same application into one single namespace, Kubernetes will give error that these resources already exist and you can't create this resource. Uh, Maybe if anything is changed into manifest file, then all the resource will get modified. So we don't want that. We want the separate virtual cluster for our dev team and for the QA team. So what we can do, we can create a namespace, dev namespace, where dev team will work, and we can create a separate namespace for the QA team where they can start testing their application. If QA team do any modification into Kubernetes resources, that won't affect the resources in the dev namespace. If QA team deletes any parts or the services into QA namespace, then it will not delete the resources into dev namespaces. So that's the advantage. We the logical isolations of the resources for different teams, and it will not modify the resources. It will not delete your resources across the namespaces. I hope the use case is very clear. Why do we need the namespaces? Also, let's say QA team wants to do the scale testing and they are doing, they are deploying multiple applications in their Kubernetes namespaces, QA namespaces. Okay, so it should not affect the performance of the resources which we have in the dev namespaces. So we can control that with a resource quota. We can define the resource limits of the CPU, memory, how many parts can be deployed into one namespace, how many services can be created, and everything with the resource quota. So that is one more advantage. You can restrict or divide the cluster resources between different users or the teams across the namespaces with the help of resource quota. Okay. One more use case we can consider that when QA team and the dev team needs the same resources. Okay, for example, they need a monitoring system for their resource monitoring into QA namespace and the dev namespace. So in that case, they can deploy the monitoring system into one namespace, and they can access both the teams can access the monitoring setup which is available on the same cluster. So that is one more advantage of using namespaces. I hope these cases are helpful for you to understand why do we need it. Just remember that we can't have the same name resource into in one namespace. If you are creating a resource, Nginx resource in dev namespace, you can't create it into the same namespace, but you can create a Nginx deployment in a QA namespace. Okay, so that's a one limitation of the namespace. And there are some resources which you need to create at the cluster level, and some of the resources you can create at the namespace level, which means some of the resources uh, needs to have a unique name at a cluster level, and some of the resources needs to have a unique name or the identity at a namespace level. So we'll check that as well. Okay. Let's come to what are the initial namespaces Kubernetes provides. Kubernetes provides four initial namespaces: default, kube node lease, kube public, and kube system. So if you don't specify namespace while creating or listing resources, it will always consider as a default namespace. KubeNode lease is a namespace which holds the lease objects for your Kubernetes cluster nodes, and these are the node lease which allows the kubelet to monitor the heartbeats of the node, and then uh, so control plane will know the node failure. Okay. Kube Public is a namespace which is available for everyone, which has the Kubernetes cluster access, even if they are not authenticated or they don't have, even if they have the read-only access, they can use the resources which are available into your Kube Public namespace. For example, we run one command kubectl cluster info to get the information about our Kubernetes cluster. So that information is available, or the config map for that information is available into kube public namespace. We'll check that as well. Then the fourth initial namespace is a kube system. Make sure you don't deploy any of your application into kube system namespace, because this is the namespace which is used by the Kubernetes components. So we'll check that as well. Okay. And this is note which is provided by the Kubernetes. You should not create the namespace with a kube hyphen prefix. You can create any namespace, but make sure you don't use it because it is reserved for Kubernetes system namespace. Perfect. And yeah, so as we discussed in our previous video in the YAML crash course, there are two ways to create any resource into Kubernetes. One is a imperative method and the other one is a declarative method. We are going to check out both the ways how to create the namespace using command line, as well as how to create it using YAML file. Okay, let's start the practical. As I said, so there are four default namespaces for your Kubernetes cluster. If you do the kubectl get namespace, it will show the uh, all those namespaces. Let me delete the one which I created. Okay. Okay, but you can see these are the four namespaces which are initial namespaces created by our Kubernetes setup: default, kube node lease, kube public, and kube system. So, so I was mentioning, if you don't specify any namespace with command kubectl get pods, it will consider that you want to do the operation in the default namespace. Okay. Then if we check the kubectl get lease and provide the namespace -n kube node lease, it will show us the leases available for each of the nodes which are used by the kubelet and the your API server. Okay. Then we have kube public namespace, kubectl get pods. There are no pods here, but if you want to check the config map -n and this namespace. Sorry, let me. You will see that there is a root CA cert available in the kube public and as well as the cluster info. So this command kubectl cluster info reads the information from your config map cluster info, which is available into the namespace kube public. Okay, and the last one, the initial namespace is a kubectl, your kube system. So let me check what is there in the your kube system namespace. Okay, so kubectl get pods -n kube system, and you will see here all the components of your Kubernetes cluster: core DNS, etcd, kube API server, controller, kube proxy, VMnet, scheduler, and everything. So that's why we don't recommend to deploy our application into kube system namespace. Okay, so that we don't accidentally delete any of the resources which are important for running our Kubernetes cluster. We create the separate namespace for each of our application. Okay, you might have noticed I am using -n parameter with the commands to check the resources which are available into that namespace. So that is the flag. If you want to get the resources from any particular namespace, you can use the -n, which is nothing but a namespace, or you can do the --- namespace and provide the namespace name. So it will get the resources from that namespace. Okay, get or delete, whatever the operation you are performing, if you specify the namespace, it will perform the operation on that namespace. And again repeating, if we don't specify any namespace, it will always consider the default namespace. Okay, so we can also use the short names for our resources. For example, to get the pods, I can just type a PO and it will give me the pods. If I do the kubectl get ns, it will give me the namespaces from my Kubernetes cluster. How do I know the short names? You can run one command, kubectl API resources, I guess. Okay, and it will give the available resources into your Kubernetes cluster and their short names, API version, whether it is namespace resources and the kind. Okay, and this is what we actually define into our YAML as well, if you remember. So we define the kind, right? So if you just check these as an example of the pod. So if I want to create a pods, or so what kind I specify into YAML file? POD, and P is a capital. Okay, and the pod is namespace level resources, which means if you don't specify, then it will create into that default namespace. If you specify the namespace, it will create the resource, create a pod into that particular namespace. API version for a pod is v1 and the short name is PO. Similarly, you can check out the short names for service, which is SVC. For replication controller, it is RC. Then for deployment, it is deploy. For replica sets, it is RS. Then for stateful fit objects and namespace, yeah, namespace, it is NS. So we can start using short names now onwards. If I do the kubectl get ns, so it will give me the namespace. I can use the full name as well, kubectl get namespace. But this is one tip for your CK exam. Don't waste time on typing the full command. You can always use the short names. It will be very quicker. Okay, and that's why I recommend to watch the videos till the end so that you will get the tips for your certification exams. Perfect. So that is one thing. And one more thing I want to show you is that the resources which are available at the namespace and at the cluster level. So for example, when I say I need to have a unique name of the pod inside one namespace, which means the pod is a namespace level object. Okay, so we can check out which are the resources which are namespace level and which are at the cluster level using kubectl API resources. And if you do the I guess let me check if you can specify. one object hyphen namespace equal to true, it will give you the list of the resources in your Kubernetes cluster which needs to be unique in the namespace, but you can have these similar resources across the other namespace. For example, pod. If I want to have the Amazon pod into dev namespace and the QA namespace, I can create that. But let's check what are the resources which are not namespace. Uh, Storage class or the namespace. Namespace is a cluster level object, which means you can't have the uh, two namespace with the same name. I can't have dev namespace with the two dev namespaces. I can give some other name, same for the storage classes, same for your persistent volumes. All those resources needs to have a unique identity across your cluster level. Okay, I hope it is clear. And this is very important for you to know the resources which are the namespace level and the cluster level for our next session as well. Okay. Uh, the next thing I think we are going to check is a cluster role, role binding and the roles. So you will see here that these two resources are at your namespace level. And if we check the um, check our cluster level resources, you will see there is one other resource which is a cluster role and the cluster role binding, which needs to be cluster level unique. I hope it is clear. And I have added the note for that. Not all objects are in a namespace. Most Kubernetes resources, example pods, services, replication controllers, deployments, are in some namespaces. However, namespace resources are not themselves in the namespaces. So to check that, this is what we run. If we want to check what are the resources into namespace, we can check using kubectl API resources hyphen namespace is equal to true. And for the resources at a cluster level, you can check the make a flag namespace equal to false and it will give those resources. Okay, that is one thing. So we have got most of the important things. Let's start with a practical. How to create a namespace? We can create a namespace using kubectl create and namespace command. So I'll use a short name ns and let's create a namespace for a dev and QA and day1 and day2. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll deploy one Nginx application into all these uh, namespaces and we will do the practical. Okay, so I'll create one file kubectl nginx deploy.yaml and this is a deployment YAML file. So what we are doing, we are trying to create a pod with these specifications. We want 3 replicas, we want 3 pods, and each pod should have the container Nginx with the image Nginx, which will run on the port 80. Okay. So let's try to deploy this application with a kubectl apply -f and the file name nginx deployment deploy.yaml. And if I do the kubectl gate pods now, it will show me that there are 3 pods running. And since I have not specified the namespace name, it is giving me the pods from my default namespace. And if I want to create the Nginx deployment into my dev namespace, then I'll need to pass the namespace name into my metadata. Okay, so add the inside the metadata, you need to provide the namespace wherever you want to create this. So I'll just save this and then we will try to create this resource into our QA namespace. I have a QA namespace, so let's create it. kubectl apply -f and the nginx deployment. Okay, if I do the kubectl gate pods now, it is still showing me that this resource was created 116 seconds ago, and these are the resources from my default namespace. If I want to check the resources from my QA namespace, I'll pass the parameter -n QA. So it will show me that this resource is created 20 seconds ago and the resources from my QA namespace. Okay, similarly, I can get the deployments as well with the short name deploy, and this is the resources from our QA namespace. Okay, similarly, if you want, you can just we can do the deployment into one more Day namespace. Yeah, so let's deploy this application into Day namespace as well. Okay, so if do the kubectl get pods -n dev, so it will give you the resources from the dev namespace. So for any command, you need to if you want to perform the operation into particular namespace, make sure you are providing the namespace parameter. Let's say I want to delete the deployment from my dev namespace. So I can just do the kubectl delete deploy and the name of the deployment and the namespace parameter. Okay, so and if we check the deployment again into dev namespace, showing that there is no deployment. We can also check the pods which were created using this deployment. You will see there are no pods running into our dev namespace. But now if we check the QA, we will see that our deployment and the pods are running fine. So that's what I explained in the beginning, that if we are doing any modification into one namespace, let's say for example we deleted the resource into dev namespace, it has not deleted the resources in our QA namespace. Those are completely fine and running. Okay, and that's why we need the namespace for when we want to run our application for multiple teams. It can be same application or the different application as well. I hope it is clear. Okay, and okay, one more example I can show of these. Let's say this deployment has the 3 replicas. If I want to create 4 replicas only for QA, then that also I can do. Let me update the file and change the namespace to QA. What I want 5 replicas of the Nginx pod only for my QA namespace. So I can do that by kubectl apply -f and by updating the file. So see here, now we have the 5 pods running for a QA, and if we check for the dev namespace we deleted. If we check for the default namespace, we'll see there are only 3 replicas. So that's how we can have the separate namespace for different teams who wants to work on the same or the different application, and whatever the operation they are performing on their namespace layer resources, it will not affect on the resources which are present into other namespace. Okay, perfect. Let me deploy this application again into my dev namespace. For this I will use the 4 replicas. Okay, and I'll deploy the Nginx deployment into dev namespace. So now we have 4 replicas in our dev namespace, 5 replicas in our QA namespace, and 3 replicas in our default namespace. So yeah, so if you don't specify, that is fine. If you specify the namespace as a default, then it will work same. Perfect. Then the last thing I want to show you is that how to access the services or the pods which are into different namespace and in the same namespace. So there is a very good note about the namespaces and the DNS. So when we create a service, it creates the corresponding DNS entry into that pod. And if you want to access the application or the pod or the service from the same namespace, then you can refer that service using their service name, or you can provide the DNS as a service name dot svc dot cluster dot local. And if you want to access it from the different namespace, then you need to specify the namespace as well. Okay, so what we'll do, we have the Nginx deployment, and we will create a service for accessing our application, nginx svc.yaml, and we will deploy these first on our different namespace. Okay, let's check the parts deployment and the services from our default namespace. So it has created. Okay, fine. So whenever we need to provide the unique endpoint for accessing our application, and that's why we are creating a service for Nginx deployment. So we have created Nginx deployment service for default namespace. Let's create it for QA and the dev namespace as well. Similarly, now for while creating a service, I need to specify the name, namespace, and the name of the namespace where I want to create this service, and then apply kubectl apply -f nginx service.yaml. We will update the file with a QA namespace and create the similar service into our QA namespace as well. Perfect. You can verify the pods deployment and the services from your default QA and the dev namespace like this. Okay, now how to access the services which are running into your same application, same namespace. So for that, if you do the kubectl exec, which is nothing but accessing the shell of your pod. So let's do this. And if you try to access the service from one of the pod using the service name is Nginx deployment, it will give us a result that we are able to access the service which is present into our Nginx this default namespace. Okay, great. Now we have pods deployment and the services for our default dev and the QA namespace. Let's try to access this service which is present into current namespace. So if I want to access the service from inside my pod, I'll use the command kubectl exec -it and then provide the pod ID and do the -sh. So it will give me the shell access of that container. Okay, now I can access the service using its name, curl nginx -deployment, and it will give me the result. Okay, similarly, there are multiple other endpoints for accessing the service. You can check those by using cat-etc resolve.conf, and these are the search entries for accessing the service. Okay, so this is how we access the service from the same namespace. You don't need to specify all these endpoints. You can directly access using the service name. But let's say I want to access the service which is present into other namespace. It can be Nginx deployment or it can be some other service as well. So I can just provide the service name dot the namespace from where I want to access the service, and then svc dot cluster dot local, and this is how I access the service which is present into other namespaces. Okay, we talked about this, the namespaces and DNS entries. This is one of the thing which you should know, and uh, one of the question which gets asked in your Kubernetes interviews as well: how to access the service from the same namespace, and how to access the service from the different namespaces. So this is the answer. You can access the service of the same namespace using the service name, or you can provide the uh, these additional parameters which are present into your etc result.conf. Okay, so your service name dot default dot svc dot cluster dot local, or your service name dot svc dot cluster dot local, or your service name dot cluster dot local. Everything will result to the service which is present into your same namespace. If you want to access the service which is present into other namespace, you need to provide the namespace name as well. So call service name dot namespace name qa, and then svc dot cluster dot log. Okay, very important question for your interviews, Kubernetes interviews. Again, you will get asked what are the initial namespaces and what are the importance of those namespaces. Uh, Obviously, this question is for sure. Why do we need namespaces and what are the namespaces? So if you have watched the video till the end, you will be able to answer all those questions, and I'm sure you will be able to explain with the example which we talked in this video. Perfect. Let me see if I have missed anything. Um, yeah, let me show how to create the namespaces using the imperative commands as well. We talked about the declarative method. You can use the kubectl create ns command and provide the um, namespace name. So it will create the namespace. If you don't want to create the namespace immediately, you can use the dry run command, hyphen dry run client and hyphen o YAML. Save the output into some file, and then this will give you the entire declarative manifest file for creating your namespace. Okay. Uh, I guess that is it. What I wanted to explain for the Kubernetes namespaces. If you are enjoying my free series, please share, like, and subscribe, as well as share these videos on your with your friends, so they will also get to know about these, and they will also get prepared well for their Kubernetes interviews. Next, in the next video, we are going to talk about the RBAC and the authentication. Again, very important topic for your CK exam and for your Kubernetes interview. And I'm going to come up with very important topics which are important for your CK exam and for your interviews. So please keep supporting, and that's it. Thank you very much. Bye.